there are certain kinds of beliefs that elites tend to embrace. You should steer clear of marriage and family if you want to be flourishing financially and to be happy emotionally.
It's very negative, and it's sort of the end of all of your personal and sexual and economic autonomy.
Quote, there is zero advantage to marriage in the Western world for a man. There's a piece by Amy Sher in the New York Times that said, quote, married heterosexual motherhood in America is a game. No one wins. What they're not telling us is in reality that people who are stably married are much more likely to be flourishing financially. And then when it comes to happiness, there is no group of Americans who are happier than married moms and married dads.
A lot of stats thrown around that like half of all couples get divorced in the United States. It's an epidemic. Everyone gets divorced. So can we turn the ship around? Welcome to Edify. I am joined today by Brad Wilcox. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia, where he directs the National Marriage Project, and he's a senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies. He has his PhD in sociology from Princeton. Undergrad was at UVA, so a man of the South, moving up through New Jersey there for a little stretch. I believe you were at Yale for a little bit as well, right?
Yeah, I had a Yale fellowship for 1 year as well. Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, I live outside of New Haven, and we go to Mass down in the city, so home turf for me. His research on marriage and family has been featured, I want to say, everywhere, and is combating the mainstream cultural message that the way to be happy is to be child-free and polyamorous and do whatever the heck you want. His new book, Get Married: Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization, is our topic today. Dr. Wilcox, thanks for being here.
It's great to be here with you.
Thanks so much. Before we get going into digging into the arguments in the book and the research, which was fascinating to read, I just have to share, I felt a little seen at one point in the book. I was about a couple chapters in, and you have a segment about sort of the Cinderella syndrome and this idea that marriage is going to be this ideal world of, just chocolate strawberries and red wine all the time. And you wrote, if you come to my home, for instance, on a Wednesday night in the middle of the school year, you'd be quickly disabused of the idea that marriage for me and Danielle is all about candlelight dinners, lingering kisses, and on, finding our best selves. What usually happens on Wednesday night is that Nana brings the kids home from school, mad dash to dinner, help kids with homework, shuttle to volleyball practice, clean screen time, night prayers, pay bills, and collapse in front of Amazon Prime. I was like, I think he's writing about me. This is so true. So my question is, I'm always looking for new things to watch. What do you and Danielle watch when you collapse in front of Amazon Prime?
That's a great question. To be honest, there hasn't been a lot of late, but we are anticipating tonight. There's a new series on Apple TV, and it's about World War II aviators. It's got a lot of critical acclaim. And I'm actually just finishing a 3-volume series on the Pacific campaign in World War II. So I'm eager to start that tonight with Danielle.
All right. I'm going to have to check that out. That would feed all of my nerdy history needs. Yeah. That would be great.
Sure.
But yeah, I think the point was that marriage itself, the expectations that we may bring to marriage or that the culture poses about marriage don't often match reality, and that this disconnect is often harmful or frightening to young people, especially contemplating marriage. And you wrote also in the book, I liked this quote, the paradox of marital happiness is that those who prioritize it the most are least likely to find it. But you found happiness in your marriage. So I wanted to ask you, what is the purpose of marriage at a personal and then at a greater, as the book is making the argument, at the societal civilization level?
Yeah. So Erika, I wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal, obviously a week and a half ago, kind of talking about the soulmate myth. And this idea is that for a lot of, I think, particularly younger adults, before they've put a ring on it, there's kind of this dreamy, notion that, marriage is going to be this incredibly romantic experience, this incredible emotional connection. There's going to be no friction between you and your spouse, unlike your parents, of course. And it's just going to be this, incredibly bliss-filled experience. And the problem with that view, obviously, that more romanticized view of marriage is it's often kind of more focused on your own feelings and your own sense of this is incredibly wonderful, I'm always happy, etc. And it also often isn't really attached to kind of a more permanent commitment. The sort of the implicit idea there, I think, is if this, is no longer kind of doing it for me emotionally or romantically, I'm happy to kind of look around for other, possibilities is kind of, I think, the implicit expectation, or explicitly too. And I begin that chapter on the soul myth in the book talking about the book Eat, Pray, Love by Liz Gilbert, who kind of embodies this whole...
Oh, and that movie with Julia Roberts. Oh,
yeah. And of course, feelings are a stable foundation for marriage. Both Liz Gilbert moved from like one husband to the next. And we just sort of see in the pop culture too, the people who kind of are more devoted to this model seem to be less likely to stay married. And I have some stats in the book that kind of speak to that issue as well. So kind of what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is to kind of recognize that love is a decision. Love is a decision. It's not a feeling. It's a decision to will the good of the other. And then when you have kids, to will the good of the others, in your household, in your family. And so I think that's hard for all of us. There's a self-centeredness to all of us. And so trying to figure out ways to do small acts of service in your marriage and larger acts of service, to be forgiving, cooperative, and otherwise trying to figure out how you can be living the kind of life that's going to make your spouse flourish and your kids as well. So that's sort of like, I think, the big picture. And then in terms of kind of, marriage and family life for me personally, I would sort of say that Daniel and I have been married 28 years and...
Congratulations.
Thank you. We've got a large family. We've got some adoptive kids and some biological kids. And so we've been kind of in the throes of parenting for many, many years now in the trenches. And that Wednesday night that you just referenced in my book gives you a sense of kind of an ordinary weeknight. But then we're also very intentional about, I'd say once a week, trying to go out for dinner, doing something, something special just as a couple. And we are now fortunate to have Daniel's parents in Charlottesville. They moved here 14 years ago once the twins were born. And that gives us some flexibility in terms of going out on a date and whatnot. And those date nights are just important in terms of keeping. So I kind of don't want to minimize the importance of that romantic, in a sense, connection. I'm not saying it's completely unimportant. I'm just sort of saying you have to recognize that your marriage is about, yes, it's about that intense sense of communion, romantically speaking in some ways, emotionally speaking. But it's also about your kids, your kin. It's about money oftentimes. And for many of us, it's about, too, a way of expressing and embodying our faith as well.
Yeah. Oh, it's really beautiful. I was just listening to another interview. This was with a Franciscan friar of the Renewal, actually. And I was just struck because he's very involved in the formation of the friars, the novitiate, young men who are discerning. And he was talking about how young men come to discern the religious life with them, and they're often sort of bowled over and almost infatuated with things like the habit, the life, the other brothers, and how joyful they are. And this Franciscan friar, he says, and I tell them, the reason that you come to the monastery, to the community, the reasons that you come will not be the reasons that you stay. And for me, that just like, it totally captured what our faith, our community, our commitment to marriage is saying as well. That, yeah, you might fall in love with somebody, right? You're going to have these feelings, but that can't be the end goal, the telos of your marriage, because they come and go, right?
Exactly. No, and I talk about kind of like the butterflies in the stomach, and those butterflies fly away, and thankfully they come back too, and they come back to your stomach. But yeah, marriage is wonderful and beautiful and powerful, but it's also tough and difficult and frustrating and challenging. And there are times when that romantic feeling isn't there, and that isn't, as some people seem to think, a reason to leave your marriage.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's turn a little bit to what society, what the culture is offering as the solution to Wednesday night, as I'm going to call it, the solution to the struggling, the times in marriage when we struggle or where it's just kind of day in, day out. And you talk in the book about sort of both on the left with the mainstream media, which I would say is mostly progressive left, our lead institutions
right
on the left. And then we have on the right figures like you mentioned Andrew Tate. I would also, talk a little bit about what's her name, Pearl Davis,
right,
coming out there. And on both ends, you're getting this message that marriage is that ball and chain. It is that drudgery. And Christian marriage, even, there was an article in, I think, the New York Times or New Yorker recently about how Christian husbands, because we pose this ideal of marriage and sexual morality to them, they're more guilty, they're miserable, they feel bad about their porn use, and they're suppressed. So all of this rhetoric coming at sort of men, that marriage is a ball and chain and women are just going to leave you, and then to women that marriage is somehow contravening to your career. It's a very negative, and it's sort of the end of all of your personal and sexual and economic autonomy. So bad. And so your book, Get Married, it says reality is quite the opposite.
Right.
So give us sort of the elevator pitch. Tell us what
Sure.
you found in your research.
Yeah, it is striking. I mean, I've been sort of hearing from the left for a long time that marriage is a bad deal for women. There's a piece by Amy Scher in the New York Times that said, quote, married heterosexual motherhood in America is a game. No one wins. But what's new, obviously, is there are folks on the right, voices on the right, like Andrew Tate and Pearl Davis, kind of part of what's called the red pill right, kind of geared towards men. And they're saying marriage is bad for men. So in Andrew Tate's words, quote, there is zero advantage to marriage in the Western world for a man, is Tate's, line. And so, you get this idea then that basically you should steer clear of marriage and family if you want to be flourishing financially and to be happy emotionally. And what they're not acknowledging, they're not telling us basically, is in reality that people who are stably married, both men and women, are much more likely to be flourishing financially, about 10 times the assets in their 50s heading towards retirement. And then when it comes to happiness, there is no group of Americans in that prime of life, in sort of the 30s and 40s and 50s, who are happier than married moms and married dads. So that whole kind of New York Times line about married mother being kind of a miserable thing is not true. So what we see is that married moms are about twice as likely to be very happy compared to their unmarried peers. And it's much the same story for married dads as well. So that's one of the things that you see. It's sort of how our elite discourse tends to paint a negative portrait about marriage and family often, even when the reality is, and I'm saying not perfect, but relatively better for a lot of us married men and women. But then you also touched on that incredible New Yorker piece. And this was a piece that was titled A Sociologist of Religion on Protestants, Porn, and the Purity Industrial Complex. It kind of basically suggested to us, to the reader, that Christian men were kind of porn-addled, that their wives were upset with them, that they were guilt-ridden, that they were sad, and that their wives were about twice as likely to be divorcing them because of pornography. Now, this article was cleverly done because everything that I've just said has an element of truth to it. But what it was not telling us really is that overall and on average, church-going couples, including evangelical Protestant, couples who were kind of being profiled here, are more happily married. They're more stably married. They report more sexual satisfaction with their marriages, and they have a lot more sex than secular couples. So on the sexual frequency, I was really surprised in this research. I think this is the most surprising adult finding in the book, to learn that about 65% of church-going couples have sex once a week or more. And less than 50% of secular couples who are not, connected to a religious community have sex once a week or more in this survey. And I've looked at a different survey and seen something similar and looked back at 2000 and didn't see this gap actually in terms of sexual frequency by religion. The gaps in marital happiness and divorce and sexual satisfaction, that's actually not news to someone like me. I mean, we see this stuff all the time in the data, but it's just, there's a growing gap in sexual activity. And I just wonder if maybe, for people who are not plugged into a religious community, don't have any kind of faith, there may be, more challenges when it comes to sexual intimacy, maybe in terms of commitment or trust, or even maybe they're more likely to be, affected by these new devices, and social media and things like that, distracted by them from physical intimacy. But it's just striking that, we've got oftentimes on social media and on the legacy media, a lot of messaging that tells us that faith is archaic and, a real downer and, just a source of guilt. And, and I'm not saying that we all know that, there are plenty of Christian husbands and wives who struggle in their marriages. I don't want to minimize that. But I'm just saying that on average, folks who are connected to a religious community, and especially who are trying to be, engaged with their faith at a personal level, are more likely today to be flourishing than their fellow Americans who are married but not religious.
Yeah, that would be really fascinating to dig into the whole sexual frequency question, and the role of porn, the role of the smartphones in that too. That is fascinating. I wanted to talk a little bit about you pinpoint 4 groups that in the United States in your data that show promise or that are doing better in terms of marriage than any other group. And we've touched on the group of faith. And you talk about strivers as well. Could you talk a little bit about that group? What is a striver and how does that contribute to sort of getting married and staying married?
Yeah, so I talk in the book about 4 groups. So the strivers, those are college-educated Americans, often have a more long-term view, more oriented towards success, both in school and work. Then I have the faithful, and these are, many of whom are Catholic or Christian, or Catholic Christians who are regular religious, attending people, Asian Americans, and then conservative Americans. And to be honest with you, Erika, I initially kind of anticipated just doing religious, college-educated folks, and Asian Americans as my 3 core groups. But just kind of running the numbers found that people who are conservative were more likely to be married and happily married, even controlling for things like education and religion. So it just kind of seemed like something today about being conservative is more marriage friendly. I think if we'd done this even 20 years ago, probably no big story there. But because, unfortunately, our culture is more ideologically polarized, marriage has become coded as conservative, and that just means that conservatives are also more likely to be, marriage-minded in their thinking.
Really interesting. Another myth that you go through these myths that sort of the cultural elite present to us about marriage. We talked about the myth of the ball and chain a little bit. We touched on the myth of the soulmate. But the second one you talk about is this family diversity myth that love and money, not marriage, make a family. And it caught my attention because your opening story is about a student at Yale and the crazy story of Rob, who grew up through foster care, really rough time, ended up in the Air Force and eventually got to Yale, definitely a striver. But he tells the story, you let him sort of speak in his own words, of discovering that the vast majority of kids who landed at Yale were raised by their biological parents in a stable home. And he says, I remember discussing my life in this class and there being this weird silence, because of course he came from just total opposite. My sense of it was that no one wants to talk about family. And in spite of the fact that most Yale kids are coming from intact home, we like to talk about our white privilege and apologize for it. But no one wanted to talk about their family privilege, that their parents were married. And you say 75% of students in our elite college campuses come from homes headed by their own mother and father. So what is going on with this talk left, walk right crowd, as you call them, the elites running our institution? Because it seems like the people loudest on dismantling marriage and its definition, they're the ones in the position of privilege where the destruction of marriage won't affect them, right? So what is behind this elite drive to destroy an institution that is clearly, demonstrably giving stability and happiness to people?
Well, you began by mentioning Rob Henderson, who is the opening character in that chapter. And he's got a new book out this week called Troubled, talking about his childhood and his life perspective. And one of the things that he talks about in the book is what he calls luxury beliefs. And his argument is that there are certain kinds of beliefs that elites tend to embrace to kind of signal that they're right-thinking, progressive, you know, hip even maybe would be one word to use. And these are beliefs that really don't affect them. They're luxury beliefs. They're designed to kind of signal that they're different, they're distinctive. And he would sort of talk about kind of defund the police as one, kind of luxury belief. And then this family diversity theory would be kind of a different, indication as well. So it's kind of a way of just sort of saying, I'm right thinking, I'm progressive. I've got this cool new idea about family, even though I'm not going to apply it, to my own situation. I'm going to get married, stay married, and, live that family first lifestyle. So that's sort of, I think, one way of thinking about this. I think another point to make is that our elites tend to have a lot of choices. They're disciplined about their choices, but they have a lot of choices, and they like choices. They like freedom. And so anything that would be seen as kind of restricting their freedom and their choices, their options, career-wise or school-wise or location-wise, are rejected. And then they take that same kind of celebration of choice and freedom into how they think about family too. And that rolls out on a variety of fronts, including like an openness nowadays to polyamory as well. So that's sort of the backstory there. But I think the irony is that oftentimes our elites talk left and walk right when it comes to family. They espouse in public more progressive ideas and norms than they actually live by in private. And that's certainly true for a lot of marriage and family behaviors we see today in the U.S.
Yeah, really interesting. How do you break through that? And can you, what is it possible for work like yours to kind of break through that crust in the elites and break through some of those luxury beliefs that they have? Do you ever see someone's mind being changed when they're confronted with your evidence?
Well, certainly in the classroom, I see that students are kind of, thinking, deeply about what's happening, what we're learning. And by the end of the class, many students, not every student, obviously, but many students, I think, come to a more explicit recognition of the value of marriage for them and any kids that they would have down the road. So that's certainly one thing that I see. And then two, I do think there has been, my book came out just a week ago, and we have a new book out 6 months ago, essentially, from Melissa Kearney called The Two-Parent Privilege. And there's this new book from Rob Henderson called Troubled. They're all in their own ways kind of underlying the importance of marriage and two-parent families. And so I think if people are getting the idea that marriage is valuable and is sort of rising in its social status, that can, change the sort of default, and most importantly, kind of make a cultural shift in like our public schools, in the pop culture and media that can, I think, make stable marriage more fashionable, which is generally speaking a good thing for adults and kids.
Yeah. You talked a little bit at one point too about what you call the success sequence. And I'm going to sort of start with the divorce issue and then move toward the success sequence as sort of a prevention measure for divorce. When I talk to young people thinking about, especially those who don't have a faith life, one of their biggest fears in contemplating marriage or lifelong commitment of any kind is divorce. And you talked a little bit about how, 20 years ago, data points would have looked very different. And our culture has swung so far that a lot of things are changing rapidly. What do you think the role of the no-fault divorce movement in the 80s, the 70s, 80s had in bringing us to where we are today?
So I think no-fault divorce basically was one of the factors, that undercut the value and power of the institution of marriage. And we have new evidence about this from the University of Pennsylvania. There's a new study that basically indicates that, particularly for working class and lower middle class and poor Americans, being able to rely upon a legal kind of contract that has greater power made them more confident in marriage. And that sort of richer and more affluent Americans could kind of rely upon a large shared asset, typically like a house that they would buy together to kind of solidify and strengthen their marriage. But that sort of marriage law back in the day was more helpful for ordinary couples as a way of kind of, giving them some confidence that they were going to go the distance. So this is this is the sort of dynamic that was unleashed by no fault divorce and undercut the power of marriage, especially working class and poor and lower middle class communities, according to this work at UPenn. So I think that's one of the it's one sort of dimension of the fallout for no fault divorce.
Yeah, really interesting. And a lot of stats thrown around that like half of all couples get divorced in the United States. It's an epidemic. Everyone gets divorced. But you're pointing out that that's not necessarily true, right? That divorce rates have actually fallen and that you can pinpoint factors ahead of time that would contribute to divorce. So can you talk a little bit about the divorces everywhere? Is that true? And how can we, reassure kids that there are ways to avoid divorce if that's their real fear?
So I think there are two big takeaways in the book. Number one is that the 1 in 2 marriages ending in divorce statistic was true for the late 70s and early 80s. But since 1980, divorce has come down. And so we can take some confidence knowing that most marriages today go the distance. And then I also stress a number of ways in which couples can dramatically reduce the risk of divorce today. And so, for instance, taking regular date nights seems to be helpful.
I'm a fan. I love my date nights, yeah.
Keeping that spark alive. Number two, I think recognizing that your marriage matters for your kids, puts you in the right framework when you're dealing with frustration and difficulty and disagreement in your marriage. There's an incentive to kind of like, okay, we got to get this, we got to work this thing out because not just me matters, but my children matter. And I need to figure out a way to like get through this, disagreement basically, or disappointment. The third thing that I would say is kind of, being deliberate about keeping the D word out of your thinking, and out of your conversations with your spouse, recognizing everyone's got problems, everyone's got things that they fight about on occasion. And so, you don't kind of drop the D word and kind of, explode everything in your marriage with that. A fourth thing is the importance of having a husband who is gainfully employed. We just see there's a strong connection between marriage and men's stable employment in terms of, avoiding divorce court. It's a whole different conversation, but just, I think, people think today that everything is the same and we're all equal, and we are obviously all equal in terms of our dignity, but it's still a case that married moms especially are more likely to be happily married when their husbands are employed full time. Kind of gives them flexibility. Doesn't matter if they work outside the home or, work inside the home. There's no effect in terms of that on their happiness. But if their husband's not gainfully employed, oftentimes they're more likely to be unhappy with the marriage. And they're also more likely to get divorced if he's not, not employed. And the final piece is religion. What we see is that couples who attend church regularly are happier, and it looks like about 30 to 50% less likely to end up in divorce court. So there are ways you can kind of minimize risk of divorce, and those are some of them, Erika.
So get married, get a job, and go to church.
All those things, but also, I talk to you about, the first C I've got 5 C's I talk about for, couples, and the first C is communion. Like, obviously, a big part of marriage is having this incredible intimacy with someone else, incredible friendship. And I think it requires a lot of us, particularly us husbands, to be blunt. It requires us to be more intentional about checking in every night, setting aside time, when you can. It might be just 10 minutes, might be a glass of wine after the kids are down. It might be, whatever, a walk around the neighborhood with the dog, as a couple, whatever it is, just to kind of try to check in and, maintain physical and emotional intimacy on a regular basis. I just was reading an article about the importance of physical touch in marriage, for instance. So it's, yes, money matters, religion matters 100%, but it's also kind of that intimacy, physical and emotional intimacy is also really important to keep going in your marriage too.
Yeah. And I think it's comforting to get so intentional and so concrete. I know as a young girl in high school and college, and just sort of, you tend to disdain what you see as the lower needs of the human. You're like, money, that's so superficial, or, or going to church every Sunday. That just seems so rigid, and let's just focus on our love. And I think that it wouldn't be quite so scary if if more young people heard this message that there are concrete steps you can take and there are basic needs that actually uphold the marriage. It's a very practical way to go. So I think, in terms of encouraging people in their marriages, what can you do right now? Physical touch, checking in, making sure you're on the same page financially. All of those are really important. How can mentors, teachers talk to kids before marriage when they're preparing for marriage about behaviors they can engage in middle school, high school, college that will set them up for a lifelong marriage that's happy and whole?
That's a great question. So I think part of the challenge here is to kind of recognize and cultivate the virtues, the cardinal virtues. And, if you have those virtues, you're more likely to be flourishing as a person than as a spouse. So kind of doing what you can to kind of talk up the virtues and model the virtues, obviously, to your children and to kids in school as well. But then also to kind of give them a vision of what marriage is all about, I think, and to stress that, yes, it's about romance and sex and all these other wonderful and powerful things, but it's about also like raising kids together, typically. And it's about kind of growing in the virtue of serving the other. And it's kind of learning like those, delicate acts of service, and cultivating that desire to serve. So I think family members, for instance, like when you're raising kids, you can like teach your kids to kind of ask mom or ask dad, like, what can they do to help? And rather than being kind of like challenged to do their chore, that they're just more likely to kind of, leap to do it without being prompted. And then to carry that same ethic into marriage. Obviously, there are plenty of wives who would just be bowled over to have a husband who kind of just is jumping in to do something around the kitchen. No, I'm obviously being honest. So, but that's that. So these things can all be taught, I think, to our kids before they end up dating and marrying as well.
Yeah. What do you have any data points on the role of premarital sex or extramarital sex affecting the longevity of marriage later on?
Well, certainly when it comes to extramarital sex, what we see is that the folks who report it are about twice likely to end up, being divorced. And we also see from some research that I've done with my colleague, Dr. Wendy Wang, Institute for Family Studies, that Americans who kind of embrace that classic idea that, we are going to force all others in classical language, that report that, infidelity is always wrong. And that's, it's still a majority of Americans are married, but it's a small majority now that would have been, 30 years ago. Americans who do embrace that idea are more likely to be happily married as well. So embracing fidelity as a norm, both in theory and practice, not surprisingly, is good for your marriage. And in terms of premarital sex, I think the thing that surprises my students in some ways the most is just that having, more partners prior to marriage, including cohabiting partners prior to marriage, is a risk factor for divorce and marital unhappiness. We're not entirely sure why that's the case, Erika. In terms of as a social scientist, I think part of it might be just a kind of an issue of kind of critical comparison, right? And so like if you've had a cohabiting relationship with William and one with Charles, but you end up marrying David, it could be that Williams was more, had a better sense of humor and Charles was more ambitious. And, David's a great husband, but he doesn't have the qualities that you noticed in those previous partners. And you're kind of comparing him to those partners, or the same thing could be true for a guy comparing his wife to, other partners he'd had prior to the marriage. So I think there's just a way in which, that could be part of it, or just the experience of breaking up, a serious relationship could sort of set you up for looking kind of to divorce court when things are going in a difficult direction for your marriage.
Yeah. And I probably don't need to ask your opinion on prenuptial agreements either, because that's sort of setting up with this expectation that this is not going to last.
Yeah, there's just the classical, obviously, tradition. Like when the generals were going into battle, they would, often basically burn the bridges behind them, right? The troops knew that they were to come out of this battle either alive or dead. And, so they had a strong motivation to come out of the battle alive. Fight hard for a win on the battlefield. Same thing's true for marriage. If you have an option, on the horizon, like a romantic option on the horizon, or if you have like this, this legal prenup that's going to kind of give you a financial out from your marriage hatch, you're more likely to be thinking about that escape hatch when things get tough, as they do in most marriages.
Right. Fascinating. All right. We've touched a lot on the cultural, sort of cultural, moral aspects, the community aspects. I did want to briefly dive into your thoughts on family policy from a political and something that made me think about this in particular, or reading the stats that you offer on the Black community. And we're looking at double-digit differences in divorce rates among, or even not being married and having children out of wedlock, differences between the African American, the Black community, and definitely Asian Americans, and also white Americans as well. And some of the arguments that I've heard, or the explanations I've heard, are that family policy in the United States in the past has really subsidized single motherhood, and in the Black community and Black neighborhoods in the 60s and 70s, leading to the breakdown of the Black family. And I wanted to get your thought on that issue in particular, and why we're seeing such a discrepancy among Black Americans now, but also then how can we avoid these sort of future ramifications when we make what seem at the time are really great family policy decisions, or they're alleviating suffering in the moment, but later on seem to have these drastic effects on the family?
Yeah, that's a good question. When it comes to kind of family policy, I think what the danger is that family policy is often driven by the most noble of intentions to sort of help kids, help moms, help families more generally. And then you end up in a situation where people become dependent upon the government, and you kind of subtly or explicitly excluded the husband and, the family itself as sort of primary sources of financial and practical support. So I think when it comes to family policies, Erika, I'm more supportive of policies that seem to help reinforce the family's functions and reinforce marriage, rather than kind of like taking things away from the family and giving them to the state or the market, or subtly or explicitly, discounting dad. So concretely, for instance, there's a debate about whether we should have like a lot of money invested in sort of like a universal paid childcare system, kind of in the spirit of Senator Warren's work in this space, or kind of a generous family allowance would kind of give families, an allowance that they could spend as they see fit for their kids. And that could be on childcare, it could be on a nanny, it could be on having, mom home or mom part-time, or grandma watching the kids, or, however families wanted to arrange it. So I think that latter approach is better. And it's more family-centered. It gives families more choices about how best to care for their own young children, rather than kind of delegating the care of young kids to an outside institution, often a state-run or state-funded institution. On the marriage front, what we have seen is a lot of our programs end up penalizing working-class marriage today, like Medicaid, for instance. So I was giving a talk on marriage at a local restaurant in Charlottesville, and after the talk, the waitress came up to me and she kind of said some things, and then it came out that she and her partner both worked at the restaurant. He was a cook, she was a waitress. They've got 2 kids, and I was kind of asking some questions, and it sort of came out that they were basically married in terms of like practically, but they weren't married legally. And she said the big reason that was the case was that she was on Medicaid with the 2 kids. There was no health insurance at the restaurant, and had she gotten married, their combined income would disqualify them for Medicaid. So I've got some ideas in the book about how we can address this marriage penalty to make sure that kind of the government's doing no harm when it comes to marriage in America.
Yeah, really interesting there. And again, something that the elites don't really have to think about when they're crafting tax policy. They don't even think about the people working in the restaurant. And
yeah, I think that's a good point. And that's certainly, it's a sin of omission, if you will. Like there's not a thought about what any other policy kind of in this spirit would end up doing for couples in this kind of working class demographic.
Yeah. There's one other area I really wanted to touch on that really terrifies me, and that's recent studies thinking about we want more Americans to get married. We want to encourage young people to consider this option, this lifelong commitment. How do they find each other? Because the study that really stood out was that young men tend to be swinging more conservative. And we talked about this a little at the beginning with the Andrew Tate phenomenon, right? So they're swinging more to the right. The young women, however, massive swing leftward, especially when it comes to, again, sexual autonomy and economic autonomy and all of these threads. And not only that, but the majority of young left-leaning women would say they wouldn't even consider dating someone who thought about voting for Donald Trump, much less like had a cross around his neck or something like that. So to me, it's concerning, to put it lightly, to think about, okay, we want people to get married. We know it's good for the society. We know it's good for them, but we have this generation that are so split. So if you could just comment a little bit about that and what you see as maybe a solution, if there is one.
Yeah. So I do, need to acknowledge that most young adults are sort of in the middle, right? So there are plenty of folks who kind of can meet and mingle and no problems for them, but we are seeing kind of a movement for young women more towards the left, especially, and then some young men moving to the right. And I just actually had lunch with a friend today who is a 60-something guy, and his 32-year-old son was telling him that his most recent girlfriend just decided at a certain point that, he was too conservative for her. So clearly just one example. I mean, this is a good guy and everything else, restaurant owner and really entrepreneurial and, so I would think would be a good catch. But for this particular person, she thought he was too conservative. And I heard that story as well in speaking to women for my book. And there's a story of a woman at the end of the book who's kind of frustrated with a lot of the liberal guys because they're not really interested in the long-term thing. But the two guys that she was thinking about with marriage, one was, I think, his immigrant parents weren't keen on marrying her, and the other was, conservative, and she didn't like the fact that he had supported Donald Trump. So this is like a real thing, What it looks like is, there is probably about 2 liberal women for every liberal guy and about 2 conservative men for every conservative woman. Now, the exact ratios vary a little bit depending upon the data set, but it is a real problem. And if you look at South Korea, Erika, we see this has been playing out there in a big way. A lot of young men feeling like they've been left behind educationally and professionally. Women are surging ahead. Women are becoming more feminist, and they think that men are often, creepy and too sex oriented. Like there's controversies and scandals in South Korea about, men behaving badly and stuff. So just a lot of currents in South Korea that are pushing women to the left, single young women to the left, and single young men to the right, and in ways that tend to make them sort of looking across the society at each other with, a spirit of skepticism at best or hostility at worst. And we're not at the South Korean place yet. Their fertility rate, I think, is about 0.7 now, which is just incredibly low per woman, less than 1 child per woman, basically, in South Korea. But there are some dynamics playing out now in the U.S. That I think will make this gendered polarization along ideological lines worse. And that's bad news for marriage in America.
Not great. So can we turn the ship around?
Yeah, so the way I think about this right now is, to be blunt, is there's a demographic tsunami coming towards young adults today in their 20s, a family tsunami. It's coming from, East Asia. We've already seen this play out in Japan, now in South Korea, where people are just having tremendous difficulty dating, marrying, and having children. And so I would just encourage young adults who are reading my book or listening to, to me speak, appreciate this and take corrective action, kind of head to higher ground. And what I mean by that, obviously, metaphorically, is to sort of be a lot more intentional in your 20s about dating and about looking for someone who might be worthy of marriage. If you're in college, don't dismiss, someone in class or a student group who seems like a good person, a good potential friend. don't let your parents say, wait till you're 30 to get married. That's crazy now. If you're in a job in your early 20s and you meet someone who's great, pursue that. If you meet someone at church, obviously, be open to a relationship. If there's like some sparks and friendship there. So I'm just sort of basically encouraging young adults to be a lot more intentional about meeting people, and looking for a spouse if they are heading down the road to marriage. And then to have like older people like myself be more matchmaker, so with family and friends. So I have a grad student, for instance, who was telling me that, I said, do you want to get married? He said, oh yeah, I want to get married. And he can kind of map out for you, Erika, like his plan for school and career, like to the nth degree. Like it's all, figured out for him, right? Then I asked him, well, what's your plan? If you want to get married, yeah. What's your plan to get married? Well, sort of a blank look, right? And so I'm like,
right. It'll just happen to me, right?
And so I'm like, well, you've got to ask someone out. And so literally, within like 2 weeks, I saw him wandering around, we're at the same church in Charlottesville, St. Thomas Aquinas. I literally saw him, wandering around with a young woman. And then it comes out that this young woman and he are dating because he took the initiative to ask out and date. So that's what we need to do more of.
Yeah, I think the intentionality, and I have 3 teenage daughters and then other various children who are too young to really talk to about it. But, they tease me for being Mrs. Bennett. And I mean, my nerves are a little bit raw sometimes, but from Pride and Prejudice, they'll be like, Mom, but Mrs. Bennett did, in the end, she was right. And Mr. Bingley did get with Jane. So don't feel bad about it. We'll tease you for being Mrs. Bennett, but don't be afraid to play matchmaker a little bit there, which I took great license with. But if you had like a couple pieces of advice for, I don't know, what do you tell your older children about dating and seeking a partner in life? Obviously you got to just do it. You just got to get out there and ask somebody. But what would be sort of your dad advice for the older teens and college kids?
Yeah, so I think for older kids, I think there's a book, I think it's like How to Avoid Marrying a Jerk. And no, but seriously, but I think
I love that.
Cautioning them about marrying or dating people who are like charming and attractive and athletic, who kind of just present really well, right? But don't have that character. So just sort of like, be wary of people who are, exceedingly smooth and popular, but there may be a little substance beneath the surface. It's sort of like one piece of advice. And certainly encouraging them to try to find people in our larger friendship networks, in youth group, and then if, go to college, plugging into their, at UVA, for instance, we have Catholic Who's and Chi Alpha and other groups that kind of provide a religious collegiate experience. Those are all places that are good places to meet someone. And I think too, encouraging, young teenage men to sort of avoid the temptation to spend too much time online or gaming and cultivate, those gifts that make them flourish in school and in work, and not be sort of seen by the young women in their circles as, a burden of sorts, or as someone who hasn't really grown up, would be some things that I would be concerned about communicating to my my young adults too.
All right. Sage advice, and I'll take it to heart. I'll be sure to pass it on to my own family. And just wanted to thank you again for all the time you gave us today and this really in-depth discussion. And yeah, thank you for all the work you're doing to improve our society through marriage. Everyone listening, get married. And if you're married, stay married.
Right.
And definitely pick up Brad's book wherever books are sold. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks, Erika. I appreciate it.